Hello everybody and welcome back. This is Mystery MTG Damien here with a very quick video. This isn't an MTG Insider episode, but I felt like I should make a little video addressing the bans that happened in Standard today, about 30 minutes ago. So 3 cards were banned: Fable of the Mirror Breaker, Reckoner Bankbuster, and Invoke Despair. Now, 2 of those cards were a surprise to no one. Everybody expected Fable of the Mirror Breaker to be banned. It was in a ton of decks. It was one of the most played cards in Standard. You can read the reasonings for why they banned these cards on the official Wizards link, which we'll put in the description of the video. But Bankbuster was another one that was in a ton of decks. It provided card advantage to decks that normally wouldn't have access to a source of card advantage like that. And then it became a threat, which made it a mid-range powerhouse. And a lot of the mid-range decks we're just running 4, which was a little bit ridiculous considering it's colorless and every deck could run it. It was a little bit too ubiquitous. Invoke Despair, of course, I think is a distant third here, but Wizards' reasoning was that, you know, the black decks were too strong and the Invoke Despair gave black access to things like enchantment destruction, which normally black doesn't get. So it made the black decks a lot better against, you know, enchantment-based removal. So we're going to talk today a little bit about which decks gained from the bannings, which decks and archetypes lost from this banning, and where the format's going to go from here. All right, first, Fable of the Mirror Breaker. So who does this hurt? Obviously, black decks. RAKDOS, being public enemy number 1, takes the biggest hit here because the Bloodtithe Harvester into Fable of the Mirror Breaker. Fable making that treasure token to curve you into a turn 4 Invoke Despair was one of the best curves in Standard for a long time. So RAKDOS suffering, especially the RAKDOS Reanimator decks, more so than just the regular mid-range RAKDOS decks. The Reanimator decks really needed that Fable to not only put Atraxas and Italis and things in the graveyard so that they could Cruelty of Gix them back the turn after, but also the treasure. The treasure was huge at being able to actually let those decks hard cast Atraxa at some point in the game later on with the help of, you know, a couple Tri-lands and Plaza of Heroes. But those decks definitely take the biggest hit, the RAKDOS Reanimator decks. And then just after that, RAKDOS, of course, is going to take a big hit from this, but that deck is not going to be dead. It's just going to take a big hit, and it's probably going to be a lot softer to control and some other strategies, which we'll get into in a second here. The big winners from the Fable ban are the control decks, number 1. So control, one of the big problems with control and why it didn't see a lot of play for most of Standard kind of leading up to this point, since the last rotation anyway, is that it couldn't trade profitably with Fable. And Fable provided the mid-range decks too much card advantage and velocity to be able to compete with if you're a control deck. If you didn't have that 2-mana counterspell on turn 2 or turn 3, if you're on the play, you were done. That was it. And you know, you were struggling the rest of the game to come back from behind against Fable in the mid-range decks. So without Fable, control gets a lot better. You can actually manage the board. You're not getting, you know, 2 for 1 every time because you got to kill that Goblin Shaman, and if you kill it, then you're having to spend another card on the Fable, plus they're getting the card draw from the second chapter. So control gets a huge bump here with Fable leaving the format, and I expect white-blue X-based control to be very good going forward. Reckoner Bankbuster was the second card spoiled. A lot of decks are using a Bankbuster, but not a lot of decks are going to be devastated by this. Who it hurts? Well, the mid-range decks are going to take a blow from this. Of course, RAKDOS and decks that were using this as their main source of card advantage are going to take a hit. I expect a lot of RAKDOS decks to transition back to GRIXIS in order to get Corpse Appraiser, which was another fantastic source of card advantage for those decks. Mono White played a 4 of this deck, so Mono White does get hurt a little bit by this banning, or I guess it was Mono White or White Splash Black Orzhov mid-range toward the end of this arc of Standard that we just saw culminating in the Pro Tour with Autumn Burchett top 8ing with a white-black deck. Now that deck plays 4 Bankbuster, and it's perfect in that deck because it comes back with Sarah Paragon. But now that that Bankbuster's gone, one of Sarah Paragon's main reasons to be in the deck, bringing back those Bankbusters, were by far the best thing you could bring back with the Paragon. Now that those are gone, the Paragon gets weaker. Mono White in general gets a little bit weaker. Actually, I think it's going to take a significant hit here. I think those Bankbusters were more important for Mono White midrange or White Black midrange than most people realize, or than a lot of people that I've heard talking about this realize. I think those decks are going to get hurt. I think other mid-range decks are going to get hurt. And of course, control decks use Bankbuster, but they didn't use it as effectively as the mid-range decks did. So even though Control will get hurt a little bit by this, losing, one of their sources of card advantage, Control is never shy of card advantage, right? They have tons of ways to produce cards, whether it's Memory Deluge or, any number of, there's Planeswalkers out there like Teferi. It depends which colors, but Blue-White has many ways to recoup card advantage. I don't think they're going to miss Bankbuster too much. It's not like Mazemind Tome, which was a much more controlling source of card advantage because it gave you that life back. It really helped when you're playing on the defensive role. Bankbuster was a much more proactive card compared to, Mazemind Tome. So Bankbuster was much better in a mid-range deck that wants to keep attacking, putting on pressure. It can be crewed by a lot of the 3-power creatures in the format, so it was a great addition to mid-range decks that do want to kill their opponents quickly. They can sit back and draw when they don't have access or no good attacks, and then they can turn around and start swinging with it when the time is right to end the game. So I think mid-range decks are going to suffer far more from a Bankbuster ban than the Control decks will. I think Control, again, ends up winning here with this Bankbuster ban. So yeah, I expect to see a lot more Control very soon. All right, and the last card, Invoke Despair. Now, this was the one that everybody wasn't sure what they were going to ban. I predicted 3 cards. I thought they might ban Sholdred, but Invoke Despair is an interesting one. Who does it hurt? Well, of course, the black base decks. Now, Invoke being a 4 black mana cost sorcery meant only heavy black decks could play it. So RAKDOS is going to suffer the most from this, of course, especially the RAKDOS burn decks where you're trying to copy this with Chandra. Chandra gets a little bit worse. Now, Chandra is a very powerful card. I'm not saying Chandra is bad, but it definitely will take a little bit of hit on the power level because copying an Invoke is insane. I mean, we saw people trying to cast Galvanic Iteration to copy Invokes way back before Chandra was printed. So people are still going to be doing copying effects, and there's still some other interesting stuff that you can copy and get value from. But Invoke was the big one, and losing that takes a lot of oomph away from the black mid-range decks. So that's Mono Black, Rakdos. There was even some other black-based decks running around at one point, Jund and stuff, even though they've fallen off. So decks without access to green are really going to take a hit from this Invoke leaving, of course, because now they have no way to really blow up enemy enchantments, whether it's removal like Leyline Binding or Ossification or Wedding Announcements, even though Invoke wasn't especially great against Wedding Announcement because the free tokens meant that the Wedding Announcement was trading for 2/3 of an Invoke. But still, it was an answer to those kind of things. It was also an answer to Planeswalkers. There are not a lot of good ways to remove Planeswalkers in black. There's Sholdred's Edict, which is giving your opponent the choice. If you're playing against any kind of deck that plays more than one Planeswalker, you're never able to kill what you want. And there's not a ton left after that. You've got to really go down to the next tier of cards, which is, March, the Black March, or Hero's Downfall. Those kind of cards. 3 mana spot removal is not good enough for standard. So the black decks really took a hit with the Invoke. So I'm not sure if this is going to give rise to more green based like Jund decks. You might see black red start touching green again to get Boseiju or Terra Sunder or Unleash the Inferno, some way to blow up enchantments. We'll see, but it's not going to be good for them. And the decks that win by Invoke getting banned are definitely going to be the mid-range ramp and control decks. So mid-range ramp decks that are really relying on Ossification, Leyline Binding, those kind of removal spells. It was a liability to play a lot of those removal spells because if your opponent invoked and you had to sack one and you're just like, oh my god, am I going to sack this Leyline that's got a Sholdred under it, or the Ossification that has a FABLE or a Blood Tithe or some other creature under it? It's just like, oh my god, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place all the time when they invoke and you have some enchantment removal that's pinning down a couple different creatures. You have to give one of them back. Now those decks don't have to worry about that, so Ossification gets better, Leyline Binding gets better, the ramp decks get better. I expect to see a lot more, even Control. Control, Invoke was such a devastating card against Control. Took a huge chunk out of your life total and gave them a bunch of cards because Control often didn't have anything to sack. Control decks run almost no creatures. Some of them would run enchantments every once in a while, but again, if your enchantments are removal-based enchantments, then you were in a really bad place against Invoke. Not to mention your finishers are all Planeswalkers, so them eating your planeswalker was bad, them getting cards was bad, them doing a bunch of damage to you as the control player was bad. So Invoke leaving the format means control gets a lot better. Your planeswalkers are safer, your enchantment-based removal is safer, your life total is safer. So again, control the big winner here. I also think aggro decks are going to get a little bit better because yeah, we'll see. If everybody's doing a control or ramp type of thing, the best thing to do is next level them by playing aggro. Like blue-white, if the ramp decks become very popular, blue-white soldiers is going to go through the roof. Ramp decks just roll over to that deck, right? So anything with cheap, low-to-the-ground threats, things like Invasion of Gobakan to disrupt them, counter magic in the blue-white soldiers deck, it's a nightmare for the ramp decks. So these kind of bannings are going to make the ramp decks better, which in turn makes aggro better, because if control is better and ramp decks and slow decks become more popular, more powerful, then the way to beat those decks is obviously go under them and play a really low aggressive deck. So yeah, if you're looking at different decks, what should I craft? What should I play in standard? Definitely look at aggro. I think aggro got a lot better, even though Shouldered exists in the format. I think blue-white soldiers got a lot better. Maybe mono-white, maybe even mono-red, although mono-red is the one that gets hurt the most by Shouldered being around still. And I also expect control to be a lot better. So blue-white X, and I'm not sure if it's going to be Jeskai or Esper. I think Esper control is probably better than blue-white. Maybe it's just, than Jeskai. Maybe it's just blue-white is the best color combination because, again, Jeskai, the main reason was FABLE, right? So as soon as they lose FABLE, I don't know why you would be Jeskai anymore, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. Blue-white control aggro, I expect to see a big uptick pretty soon. So don't forget to craft those cards before the ban takes effect on Arena. Craft 4 Invoke, craft 4 FABLE, and craft 4 Bankbuster. I know it seems counterintuitive because the card's about to get banned, but remember, if you craft those cards, you can still use them in other formats, and when they get banned, you're going to get your wildcards back. So it's almost like you're crafting free rares and mythic, well, they're all rares, so free rares for other formats. And you don't have to pay any wildcards because they're going to refund them to you. So craft those cards, build those aggro and control decks, and good luck in this week's Arena Ladder.